Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank, episode number 27. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'll be hosting for you today. I've got both of the boys on the line. We've been chatting for a little bit. Everybody seems to be a little bit tired, but I think we're going to go ahead and get through this episode together. Christopher and Teld, how are you doing this morning? Act like we haven't been talking for the last half hour.
Yeah, it feels good to not have to be in a fursuit today. I was told that was what I had to do for the entire last episode.
No one told him that. No one told him to do that. He's trying to convince us that we did at some point and that it was all a misunderstanding, but
his squirrel tail keeps popping up into the webcam that he's got up.
I honestly don't want to know what's lifting and raising the squirrel tail, so don't tell us. I'm doing fine. I am experimenting with something right now. I don't know how well it's going to go. I did some math and realized how much money per month I spend on Monster energy drinks. And I don't know if you guys keep a strict budget, but historically I really haven't. And once you start and you see some of like shocking numbers that you spend on just like random bullshit, it can really be like a wake up call. So what I've started doing now, because like I have a fruit smoothie in the morning with some protein powder for breakfast because it's cheap and it's easy to make. I just went to CVS and bought some like Nodos, and I just blend one into my smoothie in the morning. So it's breakfast and caffeine, which is kind of junky behavior, but I'm going to see how it's panning out. So far, it's not hitting the same. If I face plant into my keyboard, that's why.
My dad was an energy drink fiend for the latter portion of his life. He did landscaping, right? He would get up 6 a.m. every morning, 6 days a week, and go out and like do 8, 9, 10 lawns every day. And I worked with him for a summer for like maybe two months, and on that routine. And every morning we would stop at a gas station. I would get 2 waters, like 2 really large waters, and my dad would get 2 nozes, and he would shoot them back immediately, 6 o'clock in the morning, like Jesus. 2 nozes back to back, and just like you could see his like skin vibrating for the rest of the day, and then like he would obviously crash at night, but like he was just 2 energy drinks in the morning, like, and anytime a new energy drink came out, he'd be like, "Oh, I gotta try that," and he would just like shoot them back, and I was like, "Oh my god, I don't think you're supposed to be doing that this early in the morning, Dad." But
my energy drink addiction was like, I don't know if you've ever seen them. They're called Monster Rehabs. They're basically like black tea juice kind of flavored. People who drink like the original green Monster, I just don't know how. Like you could dissolve a nail in that shit. It's crazy how much fucking sugar's in it.
They have just burned their taste buds off.
Oh, and it smells so bad. Like I don't personally get it. But, the funny thing is that you mentioned that about your dad. Is I actually had the exact same bad habit, which is like I know I'm going to drink 2 Monsters every single day, but for some reason I insist on like walking my dog to the gas station in the morning to get them. And if I bought them in bulk, I could have saved like an incalculable amount of money over the years. Like I don't even want to think about how much money. But it's kind of funny how we do that. It's sort of the same thing like when I was like a really heavy smoker. You go to the store every day and you buy a pack. Like I was a pack-a-day smoker for like a decade, and I can count on both hands the number of times I bought a carton. And I think what it is when you're an addict is like in the back of your head every time you like get your fix, you want to leave open the possibility that maybe this is the last time you ever do this, instead of like admitting to yourself that you have like a serious problem and just like resigning yourself to it. So you end up like double dipping on it being like a shitty thing for you to be doing, which is funny.
Yeah, I never really got super into the Monster or the energy drinks. When I was working at like a retail store for a while, I would occasionally drink them. I've had a Ghost sitting in my fridge for like a month now. It's just in there in case I ever need like an emergency caffeine fix one morning, I'm running behind or something. But I will say I have a crippling addiction to coffee, so I'm right there with you. It just, I get my caffeine fix from a different IV.
Yeah, and I'm a soda fiend. Like soda's my weakness.
So I worked in and then managed coffee shops for years. I used to be like a massive coffee snob, and I've probably had like 5 cups of coffee in the last like 4 or 5 years of my life. And I don't know if I just got like really, really burned out on it or what, but here's the other weird thing. The energy drinks that you think would like liquefy your insides, because they're basically just fucking antifreeze with some like ground up speed in them, right? Is basically what they are. They don't give me heartburn, but a single cup of coffee will make me feel like I swallowed a nail. It doesn't make any sense, but that's like part of why I gave up coffee, because like I have one iced coffee and I'm just like not right for the rest of the day. But like, yeah, I can drink something with like literally with like a neon claw emblazoned on the front of it, you know, that like probably contains like just barely below like the FDA mandated maximum of something that's terrible for you, you know. But coffee messes me up. I don't know.
I'm the opposite of a coffee snob. Like I'm on that Aldi generic brand. It's the bomb. It's like $4 a bag. Taste okay.
This is all to say that we're all very highly caffeinated right now and ready to talk.
I'm not. I should have put 2 pills in this thing, but the bottle tells you that'll make you sick. So.
Yeah. Listen to the bottle. All right. Well, let's go ahead and transition. I was looking for a good segue there from like Monster into Magic, but I didn't quite get there. But we're just gonna hard cut. We're gonna hard cut to Magic the Gathering content now. First things first. Remember, the best way to support the Jank Diver Gaming and Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us, give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, how great Bloomborough Limited is, which we did prior to this podcast, and all things Magic. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. I'm on something I like to call the Road to 1,000. I think we're sitting at like something just over 800 members, and my like personal unspoken goal was to try and hit 1,000 by the end of this year. I don't think that's going to happen at the kind of like trickle rate that we're at right now, but like I've got my eyes set on 1,000 people in the Discord, and anyone who wants to join up, even if you just want a backseat and kind of listen to what's up, come join us. We host tons of scheduled drafts throughout the week, including our Peasant Cube on Saturday nights, our mainline Jank Diver Cube on Sunday nights, F&M style drafts on Fridays, where the players vote on a cube to play, as well as various guest cubes created by members of the server throughout the week, so there's always plenty to do. And Brawlbarians, we are trying to start up another league of Brawlbarians. The last one kind of flopped a little bit, but if you are interested in playing the Brawl format with some deck building stipulations and playing with other people who are kind of taking it casually, that is a good time to probably join the server and get in on the Brawlbarians League. I think we're going to be doing something Bloomborough related or standard related for the next set of stipulations. Check out our socials. Twitter at JankDiverGaming, YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Teld streaming on Twitch.tv/TeldTalks. You know what? It turns out the Jank Diver Gaming Discord is a great place to find friendship too. I was actually, without naming any names, it was kind of heartwarming to hear that one of our members went on a road trip and actually stopped by to meet another one of our members in person that they like been chatting with. You know, that's always from the you know, person maintaining and the people who created this server. It's always nice to see that sort of thing happen. It happened at CubeCon too, where people were like, "Hey, Jank Diver meetup," and it was like, you know, that's just cool to see.
Yeah.
T-shirts next time. Or wait, isn't it coming up?
Yeah, I was trying to get you to go, but I don't think we're gonna be able to make it. We'll go next year. I will say, you know, obviously Jank Diver Gaming, a great place to have opinions and meet some cool people. There are a lot of awesome people who come and draft regularly. It's you know, as we've been saying before, your local F&M in a sense, or your local LGS. You know, you see a lot of the same faces week in, week out, and you know, you get to know these people, and they're pretty cool.
I can't guarantee you're going to find love here, but maybe you'll find a friend or two, and there are definitely some strong opinions if you're into that sort of thing as well.
You know what? I bet a couple of members are kind of like screwing around, but they just haven't told HR yet.
They're like those people you hear about who met on World of Warcraft or whatever, and I'm like, did you though? Did you really? And it's like, yeah, they actually did. And it's like, how? How did you do that?
One of the most depressing things I've ever heard in my life. I don't know if this is true. It was like anecdotal, but I heard that like there were people who like met on World of Warcraft. So they had a real obvious, like they had an in-person wedding, but then they had like an on World of Warcraft like style wedding as well. So like all the people that they knew online could attend. And some other people found out about it, and they organized like a massive raid of this wedding and like slaughtered everyone.
That's great.
That's great.
Actually, no, never mind. I just remembered. It's so much worse than that. It was people were having an on World of Warcraft funeral for a guild member who had passed away, and people did that.
That's even worse.
that's so much worse. Yeah.
I will say, like, I mean, like, can we really ever say anything about people meeting on World of Warcraft when like half of people are meeting over online apps for that now anyways. Like, being on World of Warcraft's way.
No, I'm not knocking it. I'm not like, oh, this is loser stuff or whatever. Me and my girlfriend, we met through Club Penguin, so, you know, like, that's not a true story. All right, don't go telling people that. That didn't really happen.
They'd be like, we met on Wizards 101.
Yeah, anyway, let's talk about some gold cards. I guess we should introduce at some point the topic here that we're talking about. We are going to extend our Build a Cube series here. This is going to be part 3 of our ongoing Build a Cube series. If you want to catch up on that first, this is basically not instructions that we give, but us discussing kind of the way to think about building a cube, mainly for first-time cube builders. If you're a veteran cube builder, you've been building them for God knows how long, you probably have all of the information you need to make the decisions that matter for your cube building process. But if you're thinking about building a cube for the first time and you're following this series, we can kind of give you some guidelines for how to get started or how to at least start thinking about cube building. This is part 3, obviously. If you want to recap on the older episodes, episode 12 was our basic parameters episode, where we're just telling you the mechanical side of like how many cards to play, you know, basic, get you started, no card decisions really, just here are the numbers you need to know. And then episode 16 of the podcast was our second part of this series, where we talked about archetypes and density and basically how to fill out your monocolored sections. And today we're going to extend that to the gold section. So we're talking about themes today. We're talking about multicolored design today. We'll talk more about the difference between an archetype and a theme here in a second. But so there's a lot to discuss there. But first, let's go ahead and actually get into our single card discussion. We decided, or we were poking through some gold cards in our cube, and we're like, what's a thematic gold card that we could talk about today? And I think we all landed on Sprite Dragon here. Sprite Dragon being the blue-red 1/1 fairy dragon with flying, haste, and when you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So guys, why did we pick out Sprite Dragon here? First off, there weren't actually that many super thematic cards in our gold section, which is kind of funny to think about, but also makes sense the way we design our cubes. And Sprite Dragon's kind of like a very innocuous card, but I mean, it is like a poster child gold card that signals a theme, which is really easy to do in blue-red. Blue-red spells has got to be the easiest theme to signal in any cube, no matter what, right? Like, even if you're not trying to have a blue-red spells deck, your gold section is probably going to, in some way, shape, or form, be like a blue-red spells section, just because that's how they design blue-red in almost every set. So, talk to me about Sprite Dragon. Talk to me about kind of its position in our cube, why it matters for this episode, and maybe just like the strength of the card altogether.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny, Sprite Dragon being an uncommon. This tends to like happen with Izzet cards, where the uncommon prints just like end up being the best, most straightforward kind of Izzet cards for cube, and the rares either tend to be like a little convoluted or overcosted or what have you. So as Tim mentioned, even if you don't really intend to, if you have red and blue cards in your cube and they're even like mildly aggressive, you kind of end up with a spellsy deck anyway. And what Izzet decks kind of tend to want to do is you want to convert casting your instants and sorceries into like additional damage. I think over the years, like Izzet as a controlling color pair has kind of fallen off versus like blue-white and blue-black, principally because blue-white and blue-black have unconditional removal that hits a bunch of stuff. And if you're trying to control the board, especially in kind of an era, Tim, I know you said we weren't going to talk about creature stats on this particular episode.
No,
creatures have gotten bigger. Creatures have gotten bigger, so a lot of the classic instant speed red removal effects are just not removing as many things. So anyway, all this is to say that like this creature gets massive in the air. If it doesn't get dealt with, it's a 2-mana investment, and especially if your blue section has like 1-mana cantrips in it that help you find more spells to cast, like Sprite Dragon will just kill your opponent. And the reason that we wanted to bring it up today is it's a very simple signifier of a theme that like naturally fits well into what the colors are doing. So if you are going to do like a blue-red spells theme, which is, if you're trying to introduce a theme for the color pair, 99% of the time it's what you're going to do, because it's what they make that color pair do. And the vast majority of not heavily themed limited sets, then this is one of the better options that you have available to you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we ran into was that, first of all, the young pyromancer effects, we used to run them. Young Pyromancer, Baral and Kari Zev, even in Black we ran Sedgemoor Witch, Third Pass Iconoclast. All these cards have aged particularly poorly because they don't convert into damage directly. Now, in stuff like Vintage Cube, I don't really keep up with it as much, but I know for a while the Pyromancers were a little better there because there was less random creatures floating around, but I don't even think that's true anymore.
I think Iconoclast is still relevant because it makes artifacts, not necessarily because it's making generic 1/1s. Triggers
on artifacts makes artifacts. Yeah.
So Sprite Dragon is actually, they kind of recently printed a companion to the card, and it kind of revitalized Red, which was Slick Shot Show Off. And Sprite Dragon is kind of like, if you squint, a second copy of that card. It's not as explosive, but it has more staying power. After you've cast 1 or 2 spells, you can top deck bricks for a turn or 2 and still be hitting for good damage. What we found was that the reintroduction to Sprite Dragon gave Blue-Red an identity that actually made sense. It let you get access to the blue cantrips if you wanted them, some of the cheap blue instants and sorceries that would allow you to get more spell cast without running out of gas. And these decks end up just being very, very close to mono red. Usually they're splashing a handful of blue cards, and this is one of the ones that's really powerful to splash. And that ability to put meaningful stats and keep them on the card makes Sprite Dragon such a ridiculous threat, where it does sort of removal check your opponent in a lot of cases, where if you untap with this card on turn 3, they may not have removal that deals with it after that if they're relying on cards like Cut Down or Red Removal. If they miss the window, like, pretty likely that this card grows out of range of any sort of conditional removal, and it kills you very, very quickly. So it's not a card that's, got a million lines of text on it or anything, but it puts a lot of pressure on the game, scales up really quickly, and gives you a reason, like a really good reason to be in blue.
A couple other things I want to note about the card. It does say non-creature, not instant and sorcery, which doesn't sound like it's that big of a deal.
It's just Bobble Gang.
Bobble Gang, playing your Chandra 4, your Planeswalkers trigger this. So most of the time it's going to be instants and sorceries in an Izzet style deck, but you would be kind of shocked at how often just that one trigger off of a non-instant sorcery, non-creature actually makes a big difference. And I just wanted to follow up on so Young Pyromancer is one of those cards where it's such a cube classic that blinded me a little bit to the fact that I just kept insisting that Young Pyromancer was still a good card. And I think part of the problem is, like we've been talking about, I think what Izzet decks really want to be doing these days is pushing damage, and 1/1 tokens just don't do that anymore. I think part of the reason for that, again, sorry, Tim, to bring up stats, but a 1/1 token used to be a more significant board presence than it is now by a lot. So yeah, I think your Izzet payoffs, you want them to be Slick Shot Show Off, Sprite Dragon, obviously your Monastery Swift Spears and Soulscar Mages of the world. These creatures that themselves become more formidable rather than spitting out a bunch of crap onto the board that just doesn't really matter.
It's partly color contextual too, right? Because these token producing effects become much better in the Mardu spectrum when you're playing white and black cards. Just because you get more access to things that allow you to convert. So things like War Leader's Call, Goblin Bombardment, that sort of thing. You're much more able to get a critical mass of cards to be able to start converting those. Obviously the Yogg-Father, things like that, where a 1/1 token gets actually becomes real meaningful amounts of text, right?
Pyromancer probably still has homes and constructed, if you can build around exploiting the tokens, but we're talking about cubes. Sorry, I didn't mean to
No, you're good. Yeah, it's just with Red specifically, we don't have a lot of ways internally to be converting those, and Goblin Bombardment doesn't fit inside of a base red deck. It fits inside of base white and black decks.
Yeah, just to add on to the Pyromancer conversation there and why that card doesn't really hold up. When I first started playing Magic 10 years ago or whatever, Young Pyromancer was, I think, at its peak. It was definitely a legacy staple. I don't know if people were playing it in Modern. I can't quite remember, but it was legacy staple Young Pyromancer. Foils of the card ran for $40 or $50 or whatever. As a new player, somebody who had not really played much Magic, I was I don't really get how this 2/1 is this good of a card. Someone explain it to me. And somebody at my LGS, I don't remember who, they were okay, imagine a deck that wants to do nothing but cast spells. You get all sorts of advantage off of these spells, but how do you actually convert that into winning the game? And he said Young Pyromancer is the best way to turn your spells into damage, persistent sources of damage. And this was at a time where, if you made 2 1/1s and you had a bunch of removal spells in your deck and interaction and stuff like that, those 2/1/1s could carry the game. And even, Young Pyromancer used to get attacks in as well, where it just doesn't anymore. And nowadays, we're at a point where there's so many cards that just put material on the board that those 1/1s get bricked by, like, a single card. Like, your opponent starts with Thraben Inspector, and it's like, am I really getting that much use out of a Young Pyromancer into a couple spells with a couple 1/1s when this single Thraben Inspector can hold it off? Or you get cards that, also put a bunch of 1/1s on board and stuff like that. Things like Wedded Invitation. I don't know that Wedded Invitation is getting played in the same formats as cards like Young Pyromancer, but you get the point that there's so many more cards that just brick a bunch of 1/1s to the point where that's no longer a reliable plan. So Sprite Dragon does what Young Pyromancer used to do. By having flying, you more reliably get those 1/1s in the air, quote unquote. You don't have as much board presence, and a single removal spell kind of undoes all your work, but those 1/1s really weren't getting the job done anymore, and Sprite Dragon kind of converts spells into damage in the same way Pyromancer used to.
Yeah, the last thing is on the mid-rangey side of things, when you're kind of being more defensive. Last thing about stats is, when your Pyromancer was converting like 2 spells into a card, right? Let's say most of your opponent's cards had 1 to 2 toughness, which was those lower stat line days. If you've cast 2 spells, you've got 2 1/1s and you block, you've now converted that into a card. But like when your opponent has a 4/4 for 3 mana, you have to cast 4 spells in order to trade for that card. So the number of spells you have to cast in order to be able to get a grindy advantage which was part of Pyromancer's strength, is just so much higher now than it used to be.
Yeah, like you end up in situations where like you have to trade the Pyromancer and the tokens that it made, at which point like
It's just 1-for-1 in.
Exactly. And maybe you get a tempo advantage blocking like a 3 mana 4 toughness creature with your Pyromancer and the 2 tokens you made, but that's just not...
Yeah, it's not why you're playing the Pyromancer. You guys can talk about stats, by the way. I'm not like, oh, we can't talk about stats on the episode. I just didn't want to do an entire episode based around how creature stats have gotten bigger in Magic. I feel like we've done that actually 4 times, disguised as like different types of episodes. But
well, this episode is actually going to be about how the themes that you select for your cube are only viable if they're stat centric.
If they're 3 mana 3/3s on your thematic cards, yeah. Okay, so yeah, Sprite Dragon. That was just a thematic card that we picked out that's worth talking about, and kind of an emergent thematic card too. I think actually. I don't remember the timeline of our cube, but maybe we like started on Sprite Dragon and then moved off of it and then came back to it. Mm-hmm. But we definitely approached Sprite Dragon from the viewpoint of like, what does our Is It section need? What does our Is It section do? When we combine our blue and red cards together, what do we get? Like, what are the type of gold cards that support that? And Sprite Dragon was like, oh, this is exactly what our blue and red sections when combined want to do, which is how we... I'm going to
take credit for this one. I'm going to take credit
for it. Yeah, you can... Look, I would never take credit.
The other advantage of blue-red being kind of locked in as primarily an aggro deck, if you're playing straight blue-red, is that we've added a number of cheap, aggressive blue creatures, and we've talked about this blue-white, blue-green tempo shell. And I think that this gives more off-ramp avenues, right? Where like, okay, maybe you're trying to draft this blue tempo shell, but green and white are a little contested, and you can get into a blue-red shell, and your cards kind of still work in that shell. Which I think that's always good when you've got more avenues to avoid train wrecks, which I think is an episode we're going to talk about at some point in the future. I know we had it on the docket for, so we'll save that conversation for later, but I think cube designers can kind of do some work there to make sure your drafters have avenues to get out of bad starts when like the deck they're trying to draft is cut.
And you guys wanted to talk about Reflector Mage. What's wrong with you?
Teld brought that one up.
Only so I could trash talk it.
Yeah. We could trash talk it off air, though. It's not the most exciting card to talk about, especially if
I think it's still fine.
It's okay. Let's not go down that road, though. So, quick disclaimer before we start talking about these gold sections and things like that is we're kind of approaching this from the perspective of somebody who's trying to discover what their gold section and what their themes are going to be, rather than somebody who comes in building a cube already knowing exactly what they want their themes to be. If you're doing that, I don't know that you're going to get too much out of an episode like this because you already kind of have your mind set on things. Chris talks about this all the time, how people will come to Reddit and they'll post their cube lists, and they'll say, oh, I'm trying to get blue-black ninjas to work. I'm trying to get green-black squirrels to work in my cube, or green-black food. And it's like, it's perfectly fine for you to do that if that's what you want to see in your cube. We're not saying don't do that. But it means that you already have an idea of what your themes want to look like. Whereas if you follow along in this series of episodes, what we did in the last episode was kind of build out monocolored sections with cards we wanted to play, cards we thought were good, kind of archetypal cards. You know, like good aggro cards, good control cards, good effects for mid-range and stuff like that. And then what we're doing here today, or talking about doing, is how to use those monocolored sections to combine what you see in those monocolored sections to kind of discover what your gold section should be, rather than kind of forcing a theme and then making the monocolored section warp around it.
So for our gold sections, are we discovering 3, discovering 4, discovering 5?
We're cascading.
The other thing that comes up on Reddit a lot that I wanted to point out is not just that, you know, people get onto Reddit and they're like, oh, these are what the themes of my cube are going to be. One thing that I see happen a lot that I think I want to address a little bit more on this episode is people will post to Reddit like, hey, I'm planning out my cube. You know, red, black's going to be this, white, blue's going to be this. Can somebody help me figure out a theme to do for blue, green? Because I'm struggling to find a theme for blue, green. We kind of, I think we covered this, maybe it was on the previous like iteration of the podcast. But what we're going to be kind of advocating for here, like Tim said, is emergent themes. It's not a problem if you can't figure out like an archetype for blue, green, because very few of us actually can. Even those of us who have been working on cubes for a really long time. I just want to say before we dive into things, it is not a problem if not all of your color pairs have themes. And actually, I think what's a lot more important to do is to have your monocolor sections have themes, and then to figure out how they can bleed across colors rather than being like, Rakdos is sacrifice, right? So like I need my Rakdos gold cards to be sacrificed. Like having your sacrifice theme based heavily in black, and then looking at what's going on in your white and red sections and being like, oh, okay, here's some bleed here that maybe I can emphasize a little bit. That's kind of what we're going to be advocating for today.
Forgive me if I'm repeating myself from the previous episode, but it's been a while. When you start with saying, okay, red black's going to be sack and white black's going to be, you know, tokens or bats or whatever, and you go through all these, like what ends up happening is usually you get to about 7 or 8 of them, and you look and you say, well, there's nothing that I can find that fits without adding a bunch of extra cards, right? You start really running into brick walls in your cube design. And I think being like we're going to talk about, being a little more flexible there is going to be helpful. And even inside our peasant cube, which is a much more thematic cube than the mainline cube we run, we try to find cards that at least 1 gold card per section, if not more, fit into more generic shells, right? Where you can have a little bit of bleed, a little bit of crossover, and a little bit of splashing around, right? And because things like that encourage your drafters to get creative when they're drafting instead of just being on rails.
Yes, that's another big deal. Thanks for pointing that out. Having each of your gold sections be like, this is what it does, and if you don't get these synergies to come together. Now, look, if you want to build a cube around that, you know, if you want it to have like a limited set kind of feel, there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's what you're doing, it sounds like that's kind of what you've decided to do, in which case, as Tim mentioned earlier, what we're going to be kind of covering this episode in terms of like making your cube designs more advanced after having started with a more basic design. Like if you've decided that that's what your cube's about, that's fine. Nobody's shitting on that. That's just not what we're going to be talking about today.
Just like a brief example of this in Rakdos might be, you're wanting to do Rakdos sack, but there's the really, really thematic, even parasitic version of this where you run something like Jury or Mayhem Devil that are very, very narrow and require you to sacrifice. And then there's the more flexible version where you run cards like maybe Zoya or Blood Tithe Harvester, or these good cards that have some synergy, right? Your Blood Tithe Harvester does give you 2 objects that can both sack themselves. It gives you a creature to put into the graveyard for your Blood Artist. You know, it can work in this sort of synergistic space, but it isn't pigeonholed to red, black, sack in the way that a Jury or a Mayhem Devil might be.
Yeah, something I want to go ahead and cover real quick, just for the listener, any listener who might be like a little bit confused about the language we're using here. And I think we went over this in detail in the previous episode as well, but there is a difference in the intentionality of language between an archetype and a theme here. And I only mention this because those are words that kind of get used interchangeably in Magic, just slang, right? If you're talking about the color pairs in Bloomborough Limited, a lot of people will call them archetypes, and some people will just call them themes as well. We're being intentional about making sure that there's a difference between those here. Archetypes, in the way that we're talking about them, are the kind of overarching strategies like aggro, mid-range, tempo, control, so on and so forth, whereas themes are the kind of more specific strategies that you insinuate into your cube, like blink, aristocrats, tokens, such and such. Chris and I actually did this episode for the old podcast, the deep dive, way back when, and Chris said, and I'm quoting him here, themes provide flavor and direction to the archetypes, right? And for any given theme, you're still part of an archetype, right? So if you are a token deck, you're either a token aggro deck or a token mid-range deck, or basically your themes are the subcategories within your archetypes, usually determined by what's going on in the gold sections. But we are intentionally avoiding using the word archetype to mean just two color pair like it's kind of used in slang, even though I'm probably going to slip up and say archetype because that's just how we talk about like limited and stuff like that. So
Right. Yeah, and Tim, you sort of touched on this, but I want to make sure that we clarify it. And I think it's generally a good. It means that you did a good job designing your themes when a theme can manifest in both like an aggressive and a mid-range version of the deck. Like an example would be like your blink deck. Like, depending on how it's constructed, you can go straight blue-white. Everything that you're blinking is a tempo creature, like a Mana War style effect, or, something to that effect that's like pushing tempo on board or making more stuff, like repeatedly blinking, like a Whirler Rogue or something like that.
a reflector mage, perhaps.
Or a Reflector Mage, yeah. You could go into a third color or even a fourth color, like we've seen some of our drafters really like to do, fit like an Omnath in your deck, and then like fill your deck with stuff that blinks for value, like drawing cards, or gaining life, or dumping more lands out of your deck onto the battlefield and stuff like that. These are both decks that are trying to blink and sort of repeatedly ETB creatures, but one of them is trying to push damage and disrupt what your opponent is doing, and the other version of the deck might include some of those cards. It's really winning the game by grinding out value by repeatedly blinking value creatures. They're both blink decks, but the archetype that they fall into, like tempo aggro versus like mid-range value, are two different homes for what your blink cards are doing.
Yeah, I kind of shorthanded this to like archetypes are what your deck does, whether it controls the game. Is it trying to kill your opponent dead? Is it trying to, play somewhere in the middle? And then theme is how it's doing it. Are we putting a bunch of tokens into play and then buffing them? Are we blinking value creatures over and over again? Are we playing zero creature control? And just like trying to take advantage of wraths or whatever. It's sort of a like the steak and the spices sort of vibe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Question. Gold sections should be equal across the board with the same number of cards per section. Is that fact or fiction to you guys?
To me, that's a hard fiction. When I first got started, I have a certain degree of OCD. I am a big fan of uniformity and symmetry, and when those things don't exist, it kind of bothers me. It really depends on what you want to do. Like, I think that asymmetry in the gold section is, if you're a symmetry-focused person, I think the gold section is like the one place you should be willing to break it, and this is why. Depending on what your cube goals are and the power level, not every color pair in Magic has access to the same number of cards that are sort of worth playing. And the other thing is, if you design your themes from an emergent perspective, like, for example, our Simic section doesn't have a theme. There are cards that support, like, a proactive tempo-y strategy. You can build like a Simic deck that's really just focused on ramp, but none of this is like particularly thematic. So it doesn't need like a ton of cards to support a theme. Whereas if you're doing like an Orzhov Sacrifice deck, you might want to include more cards than you would put in your Simic section specifically to support the theme, because white-black can be more thematic than Simic can. So I think it's okay to be willing to play with the slots, and some people take it even farther, and their monocolored sections are asymmetrical. There are no wrong answers here, but I just want to emphasize, I think that your gold sections are the place that, if you are a symmetry freak like me, you should put the most consideration into embracing some asymmetry.
Yeah, I mean, currently our blue-green section actually has quite a number of gold cards.
It does. It's maybe a bad example because they've given us a bunch of really cool Simic prints in the last, little while.
But to your point, the cards don't even necessarily go in the same deck, right? Your Repulsive Mutation may not go in the same deck as your Uro, and in fact, they probably don't, right? The deck that really wants Repulsive Mutation just isn't going to put Uro in their deck. And so there's some cards that fit into different strategies there. As for the monocolored sections, I think that you have to have a pretty good reason to do that. Like, for example, I think for a long time in Vintage Cube, there was a really good argument to running a larger blue section relative to the other colors, just because blue was the most popular color. It was the best color in the cube. There were more good blue cards than anything else. I don't think that's true anymore. But I think for a long time, you could edge 5 to 10% more blue cards to accommodate the fact that there was going to be 3 to 4 blue drafters. But I think generally speaking, the monocolored sections you'd like to be symmetrical. And I think ideally, in this perfect world, right? If we envision a world where every gold card slot is equally valuable, then I think you would want to have an equal number of gold cards. But that's just not ever going to be the case. And in fact, like you mentioned, some gold sections are just going to need more support. They're gonna have more cards that are kind of must plays versus fun test slots. And sometimes your gold cards, we mentioned this before, but sometimes your gold cards don't necessarily go in the deck that they look like. Like Uro, for example, is a multicolored card, right? It really doesn't go in a straight blue-green deck very often, if that deck exists. Uro typically goes in Sultai Pile, 4-color mid-range Omnath decks, that sort of thing, where they're playing this very grindy game plan. And there's a few other examples like this where cards don't necessarily fit into the section they're just slotted into based on their color identity.
I usually, if I'm talking to somebody who's designing a cube for the first time, my advice is usually to try and have equal gold sections off the bat and then adjust from there. That way, everything is kind of equivalent across the board for the drafters, and then you can see, what sections don't really need 4 gold cards, what sections might need an extra little push and stuff like that. It's also worth noting there's secret gold cards in every cube, whether you want them to be there or not. So, even if you make the gold sections exactly the same with the hopes that, everybody has equal access to whatever color pair they end up in, or whatever the reason, the thinking behind equal sections is, there's still going to be so many cards floating around that really only go in a certain gold deck or, a certain 2-color pair anyway, that the numbers are already off from the monocolored sections before you even get to the gold section. So it's not really something that I would invest too much time into. If you have 4 cards in all your gold sections and then you randomly have a gold section with 3 cards, it's not going to break your draft. If anyone tells you have to start off with 4 gold cards in every section, that's probably a good starting point. But as with all kind of blueprints, it's not something you have to hold to. So I wanted to ask that up front because I think that is kind of a piece of advice that people get from a lot of recommendations and stuff like that is, make sure you have this number of cards in this section. It's kind of how when you read very basic how to build a cube advice, they're always make sure you have 30 artifacts, make sure you have 30 colorless cards, and it's we play 6 or 7 because the ones we have access to are just kind of grody across the board for different reasons. So 5, we have 5 colorless cards according to Teld. So to move on from there, let's go ahead and to the listener explain how this comes about, right? If you followed us in the second part of this series and we talked about Chris's density experiment, where we kind of determine how many of each given type of effect that you want represented in your cube should you play, and now you've got 50 monocolored cards across all 5 different colors, but you're trying to build your gold cards out from there. How do you get from the monocolored section to the gold section? Obviously, the plan is to kind of piecemeal it together. Oh, these white cards work with these black cards, so my white-black section should be doing this sort of thing. But it might not be super obvious, right? Especially when some white cards don't play with that theme. Some black cards don't play with that theme. Well, what would you guys say is kind of the process for kind of building out the gold section here? This is kind of the gist of the episode. You know, how do we get to our themes from just kind of putting generic archetypal cards in our monocolored sections?
So I don't think actually that you should think about it in terms of trying to get to your gold section from your mono section, because I think you're going to trap yourself doing that. I think what you might want to do first, if you're looking for it to be emergent, is, okay, so as Tim mentioned in our last episode, we talked about, you know, making sure that you have the density to support aggro, mid-range, and control. Or, you know, combo if you're doing that, but like that's, we're talking mostly about constructing like a quote-unquote fair cube that's sort of in line with the design of contemporary Magic cards. What I would do is I would take a look at your section and, you know, these cards that you chose because they were sort of generically good enough to support your archetypes, are you noticing any through lines? And fortunately, in Magic, colors tend to kind of have some thematic identity sort of woven into them. So just to give you an example from like our cube, and I think a lot of cubes, what you're probably going to notice is that if you designed, you know, creature-based aggro and mid-range decks for your white section, you're probably going to notice that more than the other colors, a lot of them produce tokens. And then some good cards like Wedding Announcement or Angel of Invention, if you decided to play that or something like that, provide. Teld's laughing because he thinks the days of Angel of Invention are over.
I was appreciating the fact that in any opportunity you managed to sneak in an advertisement for Angel of Invention.
For Angel of Invention. We are not playing it anymore. You know, we've got other options that we're playing instead. But what I'm getting at here is you might notice that there are some really, really powerful cards in your white section that you include to support your aggro and mid-range decks that either make tokens or buff your board. You know, great example is Adeline, right? I mean, Adeline's just a really powerful card, but Adeline makes tokens and it also benefits from having a lot of bodies on board. So what you've identified there is that there already is some kind of a tokensy thing sprinkled through your white section. So what you might want to do if you're looking to make your cube a little bit more thematic is lean into that and start looking at some cards that maybe you didn't initially select that support that tokens theme. So an example might be if you were playing like let's just say like a Ranger Captain of Eos, right? You might have Ranger Captain of Eos in your section, but when you start, like you get on Scryfall, you start looking at your white 3-drop options, maybe you spot Sanguine Evangelist, which is a card that we play, which is a 3-mana 2/1 that when it ETBs, it makes a 1/1 flying bat creature token. When it dies, it makes a 1/1 flying bat creature token, and it has Battle Cry. So when it attacks, it gives your entire board, except itself, +1/+0. This is just a fairly solid white 3-drop, but it also supports this kind of go wide strategy because it not only goes wide on its own, but when you attack, it buffs your entire board, right? So this is kind of what we're talking about with emergent design. Once you notice that like white has some effects that go wide and then, you know, benefit you for going wide, maybe you can start looking at some of the card selections you've already made and lean into that a little bit.
Yeah, and like let's say from there you're like, okay, so my white section's making a lot of tokens. Hey, turns out my red section's kind of doing a little bit of token making too. Maybe I can insinuate some Boros tokeny action going on there. What's a gold card that would work really well with, you know, red and white token makers? Oh, something like War Leader's what is it? War Leader's Call?
War Leader's Call. Mm-hmm.
Which is the, you know, Boros enchantment that gives all creatures +1/+1 and dings your opponent for a damage when a creature comes into play. Works perfectly with that token strategy, and maybe you weren't on War Leader's Call, maybe you were on a bunch of like Boros removal spells like Lightning Helixes and stuff, but you can kind of make that swap now and have a thematic card in your gold section that came about because of what your monocolored sections were doing.
Yeah, and when we start spreading this out to other colors, right, if we're making a lot of tokens, which our white cards are able to do, you know, we noticed our black section has Yawgmoth and it has Woe Strider and it has Blood Artist. And these cards play really, really well because they give you a lot of material to work with these Blood Artists, whether you're being kind of more mid-rangey which is what black gives you generally access to, or if you're being more aggressive, which is what the red cards tend to do. And since we're being aggressive, we're going to have a low curve. So now you can look at cards like Showdown of the Skulls that aren't directly thematic, but they play well with what the two colors together are going to do. So you're kind of trying to find these through lines. And like Chris mentioned, the Sanguine Evangelist does have an ETB effect. So if we put it in a deck with Soul Herder, we're going to get a bunch of extra blockers. And now we're we might not play it in our blue-white controlling deck, because it's kind of an aggressively slanted creature. But if we're playing that tempo blink deck that he mentioned earlier, where we're trying to use Mana Wars and to generate value, or excuse me, when we're using Mana Wars to generate tempo, these creatures being able to bounce our opponent's creatures to be able to open up attacks with the Sanguine Evangelist, if we get 2 or 3 attacks with that card instead of 1, we've really amped up the amount of damage it's outputting.
Mm-hmm. And Emergent Themes will feel natural too, right? Like, I don't know what the opposite of this would be, but like forced themes or seeded themes sometimes don't pan out, right? If you're just kind of like, oh, I want to see this in my queue, but the support's not there, so I'm going to make it like there. If Chris wants to relive the glory days of red-white equipment in the, mainline cube, when we did that for a little while.
Lantern Bearer.
And things like, yeah, we tried like Crucible World style decks and stuff like that, and it was like, these were themes that we thought would be cool, that we like intentionally added cards to, but like the support wasn't there already. There was nothing indicating that an equipment deck would work. It's just, oh, we added a bunch of equipment and a couple gold payoffs for equipment, and the deck didn't really pay off. So like Emergent Themes kind of come about naturally. It's what your cube already supports, as opposed to forcing themes into your cube. And again, like, I'm not going to knock anyone who wants to come into a cube and say, I want to see this in my cube, how do I make it work? Like, if you want to see it in your cube, make it happen. It might not be the most solid theme that you can put in your cube or support. Blue Black Ninja, I don't know why I always go to Blue Black Ninjas, but for whatever reason, like, it seems like everybody wants to have a ninja deck in their cube. So it's
probably because it's so far removed from what those colors are doing on average. Like,
probably, yeah.
In most cube space, when you're playing with powerful blue and black cards, they just end up being more of a control shell. I mean, we've drafted blue-black tempo decks in this cube before, but I couldn't say it would be good to have a bunch of ninjas in the cube. Most of them are understated too, so like you only get the attack with the first time you trigger your ninjutsu. I think this kind of sums up into the play good cards, don't play bad cards. Because that's what ends up happening with a lot of these forced themes, is you're putting cards in your cube or in your decks that just aren't good. When you put good cards in your deck and then find the synergies with those good cards, you're just going to have a better deck.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about cross-pollination real quick, maybe how to insinuate cross-pollination into your cube, but also like the benefits of it. First off, like the opposite of cross-pollination being like just having extremely parasitic themes that only work within the context of like 2-color pairs and stuff like that. The more parasitic your gold sections get, the less dynamic the draft experience gets, because once you've locked into a 2-color pair, if that 2-color pair is only capable of doing one thing and the cards are very obvious, like you're just going to be completely on rails. And we talked a little bit before this episode about Bloomborough Limited, which is the current retail limited format, and how that is just like how not to cross-pollinate a limited environment, right? All the 2-color pairs, every single 2-color pair for the most part is doing its own thing with no overlap between the other colors, which A, means that you're on rails once you find your color pair, but also there's no way off of your color pair, or there's no incentive to splash. There's no reason to ever try and do anything super creative outside of what is the best version of this 2-color pair that I can get. You do want your gold sections to play with each other to some extent. If I'm looking at blue-red spells, it's not that blue-red spells necessarily needs to overlap with blue-black and blue-green and red-green. Like, you don't need every single 3-color combination of decks to really work out, but it's nice when you have like a tokens theme that can branch into multiple different colors, which we see in kind of the Naya spectrum, right? You can have green-white tokens, you can kind of have green-reddish tokens, depending on how things come together. You can have actual Naya tokens. Same with Sacrifice across like the Mardu spectrum, where red-black usually lends itself well to Sacrifice, white-black usually lends itself well to Sacrifice, and if those are things that you support, then you often get these Mardu decks that can also incorporate like the token strategies from other themes and stuff like that. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is try, like, maybe not that you necessarily need to do this, but if you want to see people get creative with the draft portions and mix and match different things that you've put into your cube, like making sure that you're focusing on themes that actually play well together is the way to go. Like tokens and sacrifice are themes that are, first off, very easy to insinuate into your cube because of the sheer number of cards out there that support them, but also play well together while also playing well in their own separate spheres.
I'm actually gonna go on the a little bit the other side of being careful of not getting too cute. So the more aggressive your archetype is, right? So we mentioned that blue-red in our cube, if you're playing straight blue or mostly blue-red, tends to be very aggressive. So there might be, as a cube designer, opportunities to get a little too cute where you're like, well, this blue-red deck wants to cast a bunch of non-creature spells and it wants to kill our opponent. So, you know, it'd be really cool if my Sprite Dragon deck could splash black for Kaito, right? It's a non-creature spell that lets us create a draw engine. It also makes unblockable attackers. That would be great with our prowessy deck where we're trying to kill our opponent. We've got unblockable attackers, draw engine, all that sort of stuff. But the problem with that is that if you're in that space, you're probably not going to want your mana base to be stretched that far, right? Especially since we cut the triome, so it's no longer easy. Your deck is going to be very, very heavily slanted towards one color. And so it would be very easy as a cube designer to get a little too cute there and try to, and like maybe a drafter does that, but you shouldn't go out of your way to support it. We do play Kaito, and you could do that and create like a Grixis tempo deck. The problem with that would be if we directly supported it and we tried to make like Grixis actually a tempo deck, right? Maybe we insinuated a Grixis gold card that was really oriented towards something that was going to be difficult to pull off. So just being very careful about that. We do run a number of 3-color cards, but they tend to work well with what the colors are doing and not trying to create brand new strategies.
Yeah, it's a lot different to have like Cormella the Glamour Thief as your gold, like Grixis gold card, which is like, hey, Grixis spells, come draft Grixis spells, as opposed to like the gold card we play, which is Nicol Bolas the Ravager, which is just like, oh, if you happen to be in Grixis colors and you're playing a mid-range or control strategy, like Nicol Bolas is just a generically good card. The 3-color cards can be a good way to kind of get people to self cross-pollinate, if you will, as long as the 3 colors combined together make sense, right? Like you were talking about, what is it, Glarb from this most recent set, the Sultai card, and it's like, okay, there's Sultai support across all 3 of those colors that make running a card like Glarb make sense, but it wouldn't really make sense to run like, I don't know, what were the other Sultai cards that we looked at that were just
What's the one that doubles up ETBs but doesn't do anything else? Yarok?
Sure, Yarok the Desecrated. I mean, I guess you could even make an argument for Yarok is just generically good like Nicol Bolas, but maybe not for us. But
I will say one example of the opposite side of that is sometimes gold cards, like these 3-color gold cards, can sort of find themselves creating new decks in a sense. Chris actually added Rafine to the cube a ways back, and I was a little concerned about it because I didn't feel like our Esper deck was really doing that, but people have actually just taken that and like created Esper tempo shells now where they play a flash 2-drop or a 2-mana moderately aggressive creature or a Deep Cavern Bats or a Dust Animus or something like that, and then they slap down a Rafine on turn 3 and they go to work. So these aren't hyper aggressive decks. They're usually mid-rangey. They play interaction and they're doing all of the things that you need for a 3-color deck or a 3-color card to work, which is not be hyper aggressive. But they're really using this Rafine as kind of the pivot point to go into space that otherwise wouldn't be there.
And I think our Peasant Cube is actually a great example of just cross-pollination in action, because we have like very generic archetypes in the Peasant Cube that are very heavily supported with thematic cards. But then you get things like, oh, our blue-black section basically cares about spells in the graveyard. Like that's kind of how we've built our blue-black section. Our blue-red section cares about casting spells. And then our black-green section cares about filling up the graveyard with creatures. So you can kind of see how there's overlap and how there's opportunity to play monocolored cards that can kind of support all those different things. It's very easy to support blue-red spells. You just play spells. But things like blue-black and green-black, you can run self-mill cards that can go into either of those decks. And now maybe somebody comes up with a Sultai deck that's just self-milling and trying to cast that one's a little bit at odds because one deck cares about spells in the graveyard, one deck cares about creatures in the graveyard, but you can kind of see how the monocolored sections now give your opponents a little bit more breathing room because you're supporting these two graveyard decks.
That's okay. The pivot point there becomes Invasion of Amonkhet, where we're now able to use our big green creatures with good ETBs, and we'll play the Invasion, and that's our graveyard payoff. And then that actually goes back to the point, right? Like, we play cards like Halo Forger and Invasion of Amonkhet in our blue-black section, and while those cards do have some synergy with the graveyard, right? You need cards in the yard for them to work. They're just generically really, really good cards. They were both cards that were just ridiculous in their limited format. Also a good signal, by the way, especially for Peasant play, if you're looking for a card. Sometimes cards make really good transitions to Cube where they're much better than in their retail format. But on the flip side, if a card is just an absolute bomb diggity in its limited format, it's probably good to consider it for your Cube. That's actually one of the things we tend to do is about a week or two after a set comes out, we take a look at, what's been winning, whether that's data or personal experience. We're like, man, this card was incredible. And we use that to kind of come back and say, did we have any cards that we missed, right? Do these cards work in our cube space? Is there room for them? And if there are, we try them out.
I mean, I think cross-pollinating is something that you should do. I think you guys covered it pretty well. You should do it emergently. You should do it naturally. I think a way to push things a little bit, is to introduce maybe one or two cards. Like you mentioned earlier, there are red cards like Goblin Rabblemaster and Seasoned Pyromancer, and now we have Hellspur Pausibaus and some cards like that. And tokens just synergize well with sacrifice naturally. It's one of the reasons that things cross over so easily into Orzhov. If you it's really easy. And again, I want to advocate for looking at some thematic through lines you might be able to promote in your monocolor sections first, and then cross pollinate from there. I think is the way that I would advocate doing this. If you notice, hey, there's some red cards that create a lot of bodies. I have, I've identified that I want to do, a black sacrifice theme. In my black section, maybe I've added, Yawgmoth and Woe Strider and, a couple of other sacrifice outlets. Goblin Bombardment exists in red. And Goblin Bombardment is not a card that, and I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, I'm just talking about my personal preference. It's not a card that I randomly jam in my Boros decks, or certainly in my mono red decks. Is not something I really think to do, but it's an awesome sacrifice outlet that just straight up converts creatures into damage. And while I would say that that's kind of like a secret gold card to a certain extent, I think you can insinuate a little bit here and there. I don't think that once you identify an opportunity to cross-pollinate, like Teld mentioned, I don't think that you need to go so hard that it's artificial.
Something I want to mention here that I brought up the last time we recorded this 2 or 3 years ago or whatever is I call it the gold uniqueness rule. I didn't have anything really catchy to call it, so just the gold uniqueness rule. Something that we try to avoid doing in our cubes are using the gold slots on effects that you can get out of monocolored cards, because the gold slot, you just have less gold slots. You can't play 5, 6, 7 gold cards unless you really want to for some reason. So you do really want those to feel unique and rewarding for the people who are drafting the type of decks where they can play those gold cards. So an example of this, for instance, are multicolored Wraths. If you just start by building Wraths into your monocolored sections, you really don't need to use your gold slots on Wrath Plus. So cards like Kaya's Wrath, which is white, black, destroy all creatures and gain some life, or Supreme Verdict. Supreme Verdict's a great example of this. Destroy all creatures, can't be countered. Unless that can't be countered text really matters, it's why are you using a gold section on this when you already have Wrath of God, this kind of open-ended Wrath in the monocolored section?
Yeah, honestly, Supreme Verdict is one of those. I see it in a lot of cubes, and I really don't get it. Because you're using gold equity on what's basically harder to cast Wrath of God. But beyond that, I'll see people put Supreme Verdict in a cube that doesn't have an obvious, blue-white or blue-green, creature strategy. And the can't be countered text, it matters against, exactly 2 colors, and that's mostly blue and, a little bit white. And white's best counterspell doesn't even counter things technically. So I mean, this is just an aside, but like I'm not sure that I understand the purpose of putting Supreme Verdict in your cube. And generally speaking, one thing that we would advocate against is putting a card in your gold section that's just like a marginally better version of something that a monocolored card can already do. Like one thing specifically that I would advocate against is like putting a gold card in your cube that's like moderately better than monocolored removal spell.
Terminate's a great example of that.
I was going to use the No More Lies example, since that card sees quite a bit of standard play at the moment, and it's just the kind of card that we would probably not include. It is better than any of the counter spells we have access to in terms of the quench variants. But like it is just Mana Leak. As soon as we had Mana Leak on the client, like it would lose any point. And it is a little bit better, but you're also giving up a very valuable slot for a better card.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's one thing in constructed, right? Because there's just like there's no like equity questions really, like design equity questions in your constructed deck. We've like definitely meandered a little bit, but the theme of the episode here is themes. If you're trying to promote those with cards in your gold section, you know, you probably shouldn't use gold cards for specifically like generic interaction is more or less what we're actually like referring to here. Exceptions to this rule, like we do play some interaction in our gold section, but like one of them is Kolaghan's Command, which is just like the height of flexibility. It's technically interaction, but it's a bunch of different kinds of interaction stapled to the same card. There's not like a single Rakdos card that does that. And then another example would be Rite of Oblivion. Like that is technically interaction, but it's interaction that hits anything. As far as I can remember, it exiles that thing. And it's because it's a synergy piece because it has flashback for 2 white-black. So basically, like, it's sort of a 2-for-1 if you know that, like, your deck has, like, Bloodghast in it, and it doesn't matter if you sacrifice your Bloodghast. Like, sometimes your opponent will just play Rite of Oblivion and, like, exile your best thing, and it's just sitting in their graveyard, and you just know, like, the next time you play a potentially game-breaking thing, they're just going to sacrifice their, like, 1/1 token or, you know, whatever junker they have lying on the battlefield, and they're going to get rid of the card that you were hoping to win to victory again. Interaction, but, like, interaction I'm not putting in a deck that doesn't have random material to sacrifice to it.
Also, interaction that you're not getting an equivalent form of in the monocolored side. Like, there's not a monocolored card that does what Rite of Oblivion or Kolaghan's Command does, whereas, like, you use a Rakdos slot on Terminate, red-black, instant destroy target creature. Like, why would you do that when the black section when your black section has, like, Infernal Grasp, Bitter Triumph, you know, Power Word Kill, whatever.
Right. It is kind of similar to Bone Shards, but first of all, Bone Shards does not exile, and it's not repeatable. So even if there is, like, a technically sort of repeatable effect, like, you don't get the power that you get out of Rite of Oblivion. You just don't.
Some other exceptions to this, though, is, like, you actually probably should put gold cards in that do the same kind of job as monocolored cards if you're going just for pure density. An example of that would be something like Ellis Ilkor, which is the white-black 2/2 Blood Artist style effect. If you just want another Blood Artist in your deck, specifically one that other people probably aren't going to snatch from you if you're in that color pair, you could totally use a gold slot on a card like Ellis Ilkor, even if it is very similar to, definitely better than, but similar to cards in your monocolored sections like your Zulaport Cutthroats and your Marionette Apprentices and stuff like that. We talked about Young Pyromancer. If you're the type of deck that supports Young Pyromancers, and that's a really important key card for the styles of Izzet deck that you play, like, you could totally use a gold slot on Third Path Iconoclast as, like, here's backup Young Pyromancer, you know? I think you can also sometimes use gold cards as an anti-poaching mechanism. You probably don't want to use a gold slot on Lightning Helix, right? Because Lightning Helix is not significantly better than Lightning Strike or whatever other 2-mana deal 3s that you have. But let's say that you did 3 or 4 drafts and your Boros deck just is not getting removal because all your red decks are super hungry for all the removal. You could use a slot for a card like Lightning Helix to guarantee that there's a card that's going to end up in the Boros sections or the Boros decks hands that somebody else isn't going to take. That sort of thing doesn't come up that often, but if you think kind of specialized ramp creatures as well, like Goblin and Narcomancer, which only goes in red-green decks, or Growth Spiral, which only goes in blue-green decks, like those are ramp pieces that are equivalent to kind of the 2-mana dorks that you would find in mono green sections, but they will always end up in the hands of the 2-color pair that they're meant for. So you can use it to kind of make sure that those 2-color decks are getting a really pivotal effect. But I would say that sort of thing doesn't really come up that often if you just have a high enough density of like 2-mana dorks in your green section or red removal in your red section and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it also needs to be mentioned that these cards still have pretty substantial upside, right? Like I would argue Goblin and Archomancer is close to unique in terms of what it's doing, as opposed to just being an anti-poaching tool, because that card allows the most explosive plays in the queue. And then Lightning Helix, if you end up in a Boros deck or especially in a control deck where you want a lot of removal, you want the game to go long, it's doing exactly what those decks want to do. And I would say gaining 3 life here on that sort of effect might be a meaningful enough upside. I take your point though, that like you wouldn't do it just in a vacuum. There needs to be specific reasons would be the kind of general guidelines there, I think.
It's more, I mean, like the type of thing where if you've identified that a color pair is not getting a key type of effect often enough, like this is something that you could use a gold slot on that you normally wouldn't, because it just kind of overlaps a little bit with what like your monocolored cards are doing, which is kind of the advice we're saying not to do, is don't use your gold slots on similar effects. Like don't use your Azorius slot on Absorb when you have 3-mana cancel variants in your mono blue section, because the upside on Absorb isn't really that significant to warrant, a gold slot. But you guys want to talk a little bit about reasons versus rewards in the gold section?
I would say for me, reasons are pulls, right? These are cards that they make you want to play this color combination. And Prosper, especially if I'm drafting a removal heavy red-black deck, or if I've taken, if my first couple of picks are a removal spell, black removal spell, red removal spell or something, that doesn't happen super often. Let's say it's Chandra instead. Prosper just skyrockets in value. And it's the kind of card that'll be like, okay, well, Prosper's really busted, so I would like to play that to go into red-black. And I would say rewards are more lower. I would say they're like a little bit lower. Usually they're a little less synergistic with what your game plan is, but more importantly, they're just cards that you can expect to get fairly late relative to other cards. Like you're not going to see a Prosper 6th, 7th pick. It's just not going to happen. But you might see a Blood Tithe Harvester 7th, 8th pick, right? If no one else is in red-black.
Or Colladon's Command.
Yeah, and now you get a really good 2-drop or a really solid interaction piece for your deck. So I would say reasons are the pulls, right? These are the cards that even though maybe you're a monocolored deck at the moment, you've drafted a couple of good black cards or a couple of good red cards, and now you see this card and you're like, okay, well now this is the pull. This is the like B plus or type cards in Retail Limited, where you're moving off of playing just the one color, and now you're going to move into the second color because the card is such a good card to be in that color. And then rewards are cards that are a little bit less good, and just they're cards you expect to pick up late because you're in the color pair. This is the card you look at in a pack and you're like, all right, well, this will be good for my deck, but I'm going to wheel it.
Hugs. Yeah, Hugs is a good example. Red, green creature that like you're not starting off a draft with, but if you're in red-green, it comes to you late, supposedly.
Right. Yeah. I think that's one way to interpret reasons versus rewards. Like to use a Dimir example, like you might see Scarab God and be like, "Oh man, I'm going to play Scarab God. I'm going to build around Scarab God because it's a really solid, inevitability engine." And then like you get hooked up with like Baleful Strix. I mean, maybe some people would do this, but like I'm not going to see Baleful Strix in a pack and be like, "Hell yeah, slam Dimir, we're playing Baleful Strix." It's just like it's just a good value card. Another way to look at reasons versus rewards is, and again, like, we're talking about themes in this episode, maybe like I'm seeing some green and white cards, like some token makers. And then, like 6th pick, I see Trostani Discordant. And I'm like, okay, Trostani Discordant makes tokens. It buffs my entire board. It's really good for this sort of mid-range type strategy. So fuck yeah, like let's take Trostani Discordant and play tokens. And then later in the draft, you see like Seraphic Steed, which is a green and a white for a 2/2 first strike lifelink that you can saddle for 4 to make 3/3 angels. That is a really good 2-drop. But we're not playing green-white because we saw Seraphic Steed in a pack. We're playing green-white because we saw Tristani Discordant, and we were like, I'm going to build the tokens deck.
One of the things that I'm sure if you're savvy, you're noticing here is that reasons are a little more narrowing you in, right? They give you your deck an identity. But also, if you've noticed, they tend to be a little more expensive. They tend to be cards that are relatively easy to splash for, so you need to take them highly, because these 4 and 5 drops that do a very good thing for a very narrow band of decks, but are easy to splash for, you're not expecting to wheel those. The rewards are cards that are much harder to splash for, and that you expect to be able to get on the wheel, like Hugs, double, red, green, green, same with Kogla and Yadaro, or they're a 2-drop, because a 2-drop of a color pair is much harder to work on the splash if you're trying to cast this on turn 2 than it is for the deck that's just playing those 2 cards, or those 2 colors.
So that's kind of like definitionally what reasons versus rewards are, but what about the cube design perspective of it? Like, I'm sitting here building a cube, I'm working on my gold section, I'm working on my emergent designs. Do you think there is a balance of reasons versus rewards that should be in each of your gold sections? Do you think it's possible or preferable to have gold sections that are nothing but reasons or nothing but rewards? Like, what would be your advice to the cube designer as far as their distribution of reasons versus rewards across these different themes?
I don't think you need to worry about it too much. I think it really boils down to like, how many reward type cards do you think are good enough and you think are like actually worth including in your section? I would, if I was designing and I wanted to insinuate some themes into my gold sections, I would probably worry more about including rewards or reasons than including rewards. If you're trying to like have your gold cards signal these 2 colors come together to do X thing, I think from a design perspective and sort of like telling your drafters what's up, I think that they're more important. And then if there are some like good reward cards that you think play well and are cool that you can sprinkle into those sections, then I think I would go ahead from there. But if you're trying to signal themes, I would worry about reasons first, personally.
But if you ended up with a section that was like all rewards, you wouldn't like be like scrambling like, oh, this section needs to have a reason instead of a reward.
Actually, right now, I think I think it depends on the deck, how often people like to draft decks. But if you look at our Gruul section right now, I would argue that our Gruul section is 3 rewards and a bad card. And so, like, if you're playing Gruul, I don't actually know how much incentive there is in the monocolored sections to actually overlap green and red cards outside of a few specific cards. So I think what happens is if you're drafting green-red, you draft, like, you're drafting some green cards, maybe you have a red card or 2 in your pile that were just good. And then you get late into a pack, you see, okay, well, there's KY or there's Hugs or whatever. And now you're rewarded for kind of being open enough to play that. And so you can expect to get all those gold cards late. Whereas other decks that are maybe more commonly drafted, stuff like Orzhov or more like, say, Azorius or Dimir, I think those decks just naturally have people drafting them. And so the cards are end up being a little more flexible, where they can be poached off a little easier just because people are more likely to draft those decks. Gruul isn't a commonly played deck, so all of our cards are very good and kind of exclusive to Gruul. You've got to be pretty much locked in on Gruul to play them, but they're very good in that deck. I think part of that is just Magic design in general. Like, Gruul in almost every format imaginable is an underplayed color combination. So you kind of have to incentivize your drafters a little bit to want to play it. If they're not going to see, there's not a lot of green-red cards we can include that people are going to see and just be like, yes, now I want to draft green-red.
Minsk and Boo. But I guess Minsk and Boo just gets taken by anyone and they just make it work in their deck. So something I wanted to bring up here, if you look at our notes, it actually looks like we're going to talk about this forever, but it's just something very small I wanted to bring up. Actually, it looks like Teld might have more to say about it than I do, but you build out your monocolored sections, you're done, and then you get to your gold sections, you have these emergent themes, and you're done, right? Like, let's say you actually followed the steps here and you actually built out your gold sections and you've got a cube ready to ship and you're like, all right, wipe the hands, we're good to go. There's probably one more step you need to do, and that's to circle back around to your monocolored sections after this. After you've kind of built out your themes and stuff, what you should do is go back to those monocolored cards you started with and make sure that they all have a home given the kind of themes that you've ended up with. So when we talked about like the density experiment and stuff like that in the part 2 of this series, we were talking about just making sure that you include generically good cards for archetypes, right? Like you have aggro cards, you have control cards, you have mid-range cards, you have tempo cards, so on and so forth. You have some ramp cards and stuff like that. But after you build out your gold sections, you might end up with like a homeless card or two that you probably need to address and switch out, which could be a good opportunity to actually support a theme better by taking that card out and putting something thematic in its place. So an example of this, imagine you're doing that density experiment, you're starting with monocolored sections, and you've included a couple generically good flying men type creatures, 1 mana 1/1s in blue with some sort of upside, but then you build out your themes, and it's very clear that there isn't really a deck that's going to be at your table that really wants flying men. So what you need to do is go back to those flying men and probably take them out in favor of something that's actually going to have a home in at least one of your decks. Something thematic can take its place. We don't really play any flying men in our cubes. I think we might still be on Spyglass Siren, but we cut it, right?
We cut it to make room for something else.
Yeah, and there was a point in our cube design where we had, I think, multiple flying men, like the Flash Pirate and stuff like that. We played Spyglass Siren here not too long ago. And it became clear to us over time that, there isn't a deck at our table that really consistently wants flying men. So we now use those slots on other cards, whether they're generic effects or thematic cards, doesn't really matter. The point being that once we kind of saw how our gold sections played out and how our multicolored decks come together, we realized we had cards that didn't really have a home. And I think that's an important part of this process, is to reevaluate the monocolored cards after you've actually built out the gold sections and make sure all of the cards have a place. One way to do that is when you're doing the density experiment, just make sure that you're including about a bunch of theme agnostic cards. So a card like Elite Spellbinder, 3 mana, 3/1 flyer, snipes a card from your opponent's hand, makes them pay 2 extra to cast it as long as it's exiled. That is just a good card that goes in a lot of different decks, independent of what the theme of that deck is. Bone Crusher Giant is another example. I would say a card like Scavenging Ooze kind of fits the bill, even though Scavenging Ooze doesn't end up in main decks a lot. Basically, any green deck could put a Scavenging Ooze in it, right? It doesn't have to be thematic or anything like that. So making sure you insinuate some number of cards that are theme agnostic can help you get around this, but also just make sure your cards have a home.
Yeah. So I actually had a ton of stuff on here and then realized most of it's related to tuning your cube and after, it's related to threats versus removal and stuff. So I'm just going to worry about that for a future episode.
Part 4, baby. Part 4.
Yeah. But I will just say, in regards to what you said about do your cards have a home, another thing is as you draft your cube, right? And as people play it, kind of see what works and what doesn't, and kind of keep a note. We actually have a couple of documents that we run of cards that are on the fence, whether they're too good, which hasn't come up really recently, or just more commonly not really pulling their weight, not finding homes. And so we just mark those down. And those are cards that are the first ones we look at when we get new sets where we've got new exciting cards to try out. Those are the ones that we're like, okay, can we give this one a break? Can we try something else in this spot? So I think that's a good habit to get into, especially since it's not always obvious before you've played your cube that a certain type of effect is just not going to work. Like the flying man thing. Maybe you think that they're going to be great in your tempo shell, but they're not, right? They need pump effects. You need things that can get their stats above 1/1. And if you don't run a sufficient density of that, it might not be obvious that these cards are not good tempo cards, whereas cards that have flash and 2 power and flying are actually pretty good. The other thing I would say is be careful with the theme agnostic cards. I would say most of the best cards in our cube end up being theme agnostic, but I think you want your synergy pieces, when they're really maximized, they need to have some sort of substantial impact on the game. So the example I went to is I think Yawgmoth and Goblin Bombardment, when maximized in the sack deck, are truly broken cards. They are really, really, really powerful. And comparatively, we've seen the rise of a card like Bristly Bill. Maybe this is even a bad example because Bristly Bill accidentally creates synergy, but it's just way better than all the synergy things you could be doing in most lanes, right? It's just like a stat monster that wins the game on its own if you keep it alive for a while. But it does have +1/+1 counter synergy, which kind of creates its own innate synergy, which is actually kind of cool. But my point here is that these theme agnostic cards probably should be very good in the backbone of your cube. But when you really are maximizing these narrow thematic cards, cards like Delny are another good example of cards that when they're really maximized, they are broken. They are very, very powerful, and they will be worth the investment you had to do of going deep on a card.
You're talking about something that we talked on like our band episode not too long ago, where there's a big difference between having like Yawgmoth be a card in your cube and having like Shieldred the Apocalypse being a card in your cube, right? Because Shieldred the Apocalypse is just like, it is theme agnostic, but it's such an obnoxiously good card no matter what you're doing, that it's just like kind of a questionable card to have around in a cube of our power level. Whereas Yawgmoth is equally obnoxious, but for fewer decks, for a very specific kind of deck. So it's a little bit more tolerable there. So I get what you're saying about watching out with the theme agnostic cards. Like, generically good cards does not mean you should have like Fable of the Mirror Breaker style cards in your monocolored sections either. But that's kind of a discussion for a different time. Another example of what I was talking about would be like, let's say you put like, you're building out your monocolored sections, you put cards like Woe Strider and Village Rites in, and then you kind of like wrap up your cube, you're reviewing it and stuff like that, and you're like, I don't really have a sacrifice deck here. It'd be hard not to have a sacrifice deck. But I could see people building out a cube and building out a black section in particular where it doesn't really support sacrifice so much as like black aggro or something like that. And then like your cards like Village Rites and Woe Strider are just kind of like straggling there. They could be played in your black aggro deck, but they don't really point to an aristocrat's theme that's not in your cube. So like those would be the type of cards that you might sub out for like actual black aggro cards or just another removal spell or something like that. So
yeah, and this is going to be power level contextual. I think what we've seen historically in Magic is when you move to when you go into the truly powerful range of Magic cards, a lot of times these sack effects get pushed to the side for more reanimation and mid-range value. And so you need to be cognizant of what kind of power level your cube is. Though certain prints, like I mentioned, Goblin Bombardment and Yawgmoth really do make these sort of decks have some backbone in more powerful environments.
Mm-hmm. The only other thing I really wanted to mention here, and this isn't even a big thing, but it's something I wanted to mention for anyone who's at this point in the episode who is just kind of like, hey, I'm building my first cube, I need advice on things. Like, this is a question that I could see people asking, and I want to get your guys' take on it, because a lot of people have a lot of different answers here. But from the devil's advocate part of this question, like, if you're a first-time cube builder, how do you go about, like, the actual classification of, like, gold cards, like hybrid cards, or monocolored cards that have like a gold identity? So think like things like Kenrith the Return King, which is a white card but has like multiple colored activations and its ability, or a card like Terra Sunder, which is 1 in a green to exile an artifact or enchantment, but it has a 1 in a black kicker cost. Like, what are your guys' advice as far as actually slotting those in somewhere in your cube, like visually or whatever, for the people who actually ask that question? Because I think that's like, for us, it's like we kind of roll our eyes at that question a little bit, but like that's a question that gets asked by new cube designers is, where am I supposed to put this card in the cube? I have Luris. Where am I supposed to put it? Is it an Orzhov card? Do I classify it as a white card, a black card? Like, where do I put these hybrid cards and things like that?
I would kind of go to this is, as much as I would love a heuristic, as much as I would love a system that we could just say, all these cards of this effect go here. I think you kind of have to judge them individually based on what they're doing in your cube and what your cube's power level is. So a couple of examples. We had the green-white Kellen in our cube for a while, and it was a monocolored card, right? The green activation was something you could do, but it was very minimal. It was not the reason we were playing the card. On the flip side, we still run Mosswood Dread Knight, and we categorize it as a green-black card because I'm not going to put a green 3/2 Trampler into my deck if I can't access the black portion of the card, so I need the Golgari section of that card to work. Hybrids, sometimes they're secret monocolored cards. The one that's jumping to mind is Judge's Familiar, but that one isn't even a secret monocolored card. That's one of those examples of a true hybrid card, but like I think it was better in white decks than blue on average. I think Ravenous Squirrel is the one I had. Yes, Ravenous Squirrel is the one I had listed because that's a black card. It's not a green card. What are you doing with it in a base green deck?
Yeah, the Ravenous Squirrel is a hybrid Golgari mana for a 1/1 that gets bigger when you sacrifice things and has like a sacrifice outlet attached to it. And it's just like, if you're a green deck that doesn't have black in it, are you ever putting that sacrifice energy piece in there? The answer is no. Like, I cannot imagine a mono green deck that plays Ravenous Squirrel, but you will absolutely play it in a black deck, and then you have to find like green mana for the activation or whatever. But that's the type of card we classify as a mono black card, because you're never putting it in a green deck.
Right. And I think it also ends up being format contextual. So for example, in your Affinity Cube or in like Vintage Cube, I would consider a card like Terra Sunder to just be a green card. And if I can access the black portion of the card, that's cool. But if your environment is very artifact and enchantment heavy, if that's a fundamental pillar of the environment, then you're putting Terra Sunder in there to interact with those cards. Whereas if we put it in the main cube, not that we would, but like say we did, I think we would have to classify it as a green-black card, because you would be putting it in your deck primarily to kill things that are not artifacts and enchantments.
This is all to say, like, don't get too caught up on the actual classification of things like this, because ultimately just put them where you think they go. Unburial Rites is always one that trips me up, because I'm like, you play this in a black deck, it's optimized in a black-white deck, though, but if you're in a mono-black deck, you'll find white sources to flash it back, and it's just like, at the end of the day, just pick a place to put it, right? If you're the type of person who's going for equal gold sections, like, you might finagle things into different spots, but honestly, just like, when you're looking at a card that has like an extra pip on it somewhere that's relevant to the card, just ask yourself the question, like, what decks are going to play this, and then classify it accordingly. I do think that's a question that gets asked a lot. It's not actually super important what the answer is, so much as like just figure out where you want to put it and like be honest with like the type of decks that you think are going to play it. So I did want to ask that for the newbies out there who are just like, where am I supposed to put Lurrus in my cube? You know, like, where am I supposed to put Ravenous Squirrel in my cube? Does it use one of my Golgari slots? And it's like, you know what? The answer doesn't matter. If you want it to use a Golgari slot, go for it. If you don't, put it wherever you think it goes. Is there anything you guys, like, any advice you want to give to kind of wrap things up, or any final parameters you think people should kind of adhere to?
Yeah. This whole conversation and this entire episode could have been avoided by just not including gold cards in your cube. That's clearly the easiest answer.
Don't play gold cards. Okay.
Don't do it.
In a lot of ways, like, I think gold cards are kind of like the appeal for a lot of people to build cubes. Like, you do see people start off cubes by making their gold sections, and then everything else comes afterwards. Like, do you think that's bad cube design to start with all of your gold cards?
Oh yeah.
And then work backwards? Unless
that's the point. Like, if that's the point, go for it. Again, like, I don't want to tell anybody how they can or can't have fun. And maybe it's not a problem if your cube doesn't get drafted very often, but I think you really end up stunting your drafter's creativity by doing that. And I think you might actually find it, like, way more frustrating to get your design right.
Yeah, I think a lot of people jump to that as, I'm going to make my gold sections and then I'll fill out the rest. And I think that leads to a lot of headaches. I think one of the things we've learned is not really to do that. If you do kind of want to just put gold cards you like in a cube, I think the way to do this is the way Fletcher and I have actually been designing the standard cube. Since we have such a small card pool to work with, what we do is we go through each set and we literally throw spaghetti on the wall. So we just go in through each set individually and we pull out every single card that we find interesting and we throw it into the cube. And then we take a look at the big picture and we see, like, okay, what do our gold cards enable? What do our monocolored cards enable? And, like, what doesn't fit? Right. And that works with it pretty well with a really small card pool, but it's also not necessarily something I would recommend for traditional cube design where you've got, 30 sets to look at. We have like 10. So it's a lot more manageable.
Yeah, and the alternative of that would be like, we're building a standard cube, and I want to make sure red-green dinosaurs is the red-green color pair, and it's like, now I got to go through and find all the dinosaurs for the monocolored sections that might be doing these very parasitic things, as opposed to just filling out like, oh, here's a bunch of standard cards that I think are really good, and then it's like, oh, there's a bunch of red-green dinosaurs in the red and green sections, respectively. Maybe we can find support for that in the gold section. It's just different mentality that kind of leads to the same place, but leads to overall better cube design, more flexible, cross-pollinated design than very parasitic archetypes, because you don't want your cube to be a bloom burrow. Like, do not let your cube become a bloom burrow.
That's exactly how the red-green dinosaurs deck in the standard cube came about. Is we just looked at it, we're like, a lot of the best red and green cards we have access to are dinosaurs. Is they're like, and then we looked and we're like, okay, well, there's a couple of good dinosaur synergy cards that get a little bit better, like Triumphant Chomp, the shock, but it gets bigger if you have a dinosaur, right? And so if you've got 8-10 dinosaurs in your cube that are all pretty good, that card suddenly becomes a cool little synergy piece that fits into your deck, and like other decks can even play it, right? If you just really need a shock, you can put that card in your deck. So that was sort of the emergent design coming in there, where we didn't set out to say red-green dinosaurs was going to be our red-green color pair. It just turns out a lot of the best cards in red and green happen to be dinosaurs.
Yeah, so we're going to close it out there. I think our original plan was to have minimum 4 parts to this series, and assuming that like you're following along and actually following some of these steps and things like that, or at least taking it into account when you're building your cube. By this point, you would have a fully fleshed out monocolored section with gold sections that have themes that are supported by what's going on in the monocolored sections. I don't think we're going to dedicate an entire episode to lands or anything like that, but we might talk about lands, periodically throughout different episodes. But as far as a part 4 to this series goes, I think what I would suggest to us here is to talk about like the feedback loop on a cube and testing and how to make adjustments to a finished cube, like when to change out things, when to, insinuate different themes, how, especially I have a lot to say about how to process player feedback, because I think player feedback is not usually well crafted, so to speak.
Too much removal, too little removal.
Too much removal, too much. Yep. I wasn't able to kill every single creature my opponent plays, so there's not enough removal in this cube. That sort of thing. So I think that's what I would like to approach for part 4 of this series, which will be in a little while. We like to distance ourselves between the different episodes here. And of course, we've got to get through infinite spoiler season for the last couple months of this this year with Duskmourn and Foundations coming out by the end of the year as well. Good news is, I thought Duskmourn came out at the end of August. It actually comes out at the end of September. So we do have some wiggle room here as far as episode topics go. We did our closing up top, but I do want to remind everybody to check out our socials. If you want to hear more from us, you can find us on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, youtube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Teld streaming on twitch.tv/TeldTalks, TELD Talks. That's all we have for you today. I appreciate everybody hanging out and listening and getting to this point in the episode, and we will see you all next time. I'm going to venture a guess that you guys have not followed along with anything from Mystery Booster 2 that's been announced.
You fool! I have followed a little of it.
Yeah? What are you following necessarily? Because there's a lot.
Well, I've been kind of like peeking at the Images channel, so I know there was a bunch of really cool lands, and there was that cool wizard that combines a card with your hand, and there's like a spaceship that does a bunch of stuff. So I wouldn't say I know they've also printed some alchemy cards into paper, which is interesting.
I wanted to ask what you guys thought of that. There are 7 alchemy cards, digital only mechanics that don't work in paper very well. You can kind of finagle them to work, but 7 of those cards are printed as acorn stamped cards in Mystery Booster 2, which means they're not tournament legal. They're really only here for like the convention experience. But does that rub you guys in any sort of way? Like, do you think that's cool? Do you think that's really stupid? Like, we're talking like Tenacious Pup, Oracle of the Alpha. Like, what are your thoughts on those alchemy cards?
Oracle of the Alpha is really dumb. Like, I'm sorry, but I have to go get a set of cards that are sleeved up and shuffle in 9 more cards into my deck. That is insanity. But I don't think there's any reason why the boon system that they use on cards like Tenacious Pup cannot be implemented if we are having to keep track of like 16 different roll tokens and 17,000 mechanics every set. And now we've got, for the rest of the game, you can't gain life. And there's so many mechanics going on in Magic right now that I think the tracking argument is nonsense. And we just need to allow cards like boons to exist. Because I think Tenacious Pup you could print into a standard set and it would be a nifty little card. I think it would be quite decent. But I don't think it would be broken, right? Nobody's clamoring. We don't even run Tenacious Pup in the Peasant Cube because we don't think it's good enough there, right? I mean,
I don't know. I know it's a convention experience. I know it's a just for fun thing, but like, The logistics of like casting an Oracle of the Alpha and being like, oh, did I even have 9 extra sleeves that matched like my deck? Like, and then what happens if you blink it? Well, I gotta get 9 more proxy whatever's. I find it a little annoying, but also kind of cool to see these things in paper. It doesn't work with the digital art, I'll tell you that. The Tenacious Pup, I give Tenacious Pup a lot of crap for having like some of the worst art in Magic the Gathering, and it's because of the digital nature of it. So seeing it on a paper card is just like really goofy to me. But
I will say there's some really cool designs I like seeing in these playtests. Like there's one that it has a casting cost of a D, right? And it's like red to D. And D's casting cost is it takes your land drop per turn. And I don't know how mechanically that would work in Magic, but I think that is just very nifty. And there's like a land with Madness 0, but it doesn't come into play for free. You have to like actually have your land drop on your turn.
Yeah. So would you say you want the D? Is that what you would say? Is that something that you would agree to?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I would say that. Just that the designs, the designs in these playtest material or whatever mystery booster cards or whatever. I think there's a lot of cool stuff here, and I hope we see non-silver bordered implementation of some of these effects. I think it would be very cool.
We will. I'm confident that we will. I don't know which ones they'll be, but like if you think back to the original Mystery Booster, that was the debut of Flying Counters. The Flying Counters were on a card from Mystery Booster before they were in Ikoria, and there's a couple other examples of Mystery Booster like play test cards that were doing these goofy things that have since been implemented into Magic. So that's the thing I was looking for, is I was poking around to see like, oh, which of these are like, because a lot of them are just goofball like nonsense things or like internal references to cards. Like there's a reference to fucking Floral Spasm on one of these cards, which is just like the deepest cut. But then there's some other mechanics that are like, wait a second, there might be something here. So like there's this card called Immersturm Battlefield, which is 1 in a red for an enchantment with the sub-theme Realm. And it says hosted creatures get +2/+0 and have haste, and you can host a creature for 1 in a red. So it's just like an enchantment that sits on board, and then you can pay a cost to kind of add a creature to that realm and give its abilities to it. And that's just like, there's nothing silver border about that. It's just kind of a clean mechanic that makes sense, and I could see like doing some really cool things. And then you get these cards that are actually just like straight up Magic cards. I forget what it's called. Oh, Wrath of Lefnik is a card I wanted to ask you guys about. It's 1 white blue sorcery. Destroy all creatures, untap up to 4 lands you control. Like Supreme Verdict, but untap 4 lands as it resolves. Like,
okay,
is that a card we would play if we had it? Like Wrath, untap 4 lands, but it's like heavy Azorius commitment.
How do you lose the game after you resolve that?
I don't know.
Yeah, that would be kind of my question. Is like,
yes, I play my 0 mana Wrath.
yeah, part of the issue with Wraths in the modern era is like so many creatures come down after the Wrath and either have haste or like immediately impact the board or something. So unless you're getting like a 3-for-1 off of a Wrath, it generally speaking just doesn't even feel particularly good to Wrath, which is I think why they keep like pushing Wraths into like increasingly like Wrath and get value sort of territory. But dude, if I get to Wrath and it basically has like rewind text on it, like I'm gonna Wrath your board, and then I have my counter magic up. Like again, yeah, like Teld said, like how do I lose from there against a creature deck?
Yeah, there's I'm scrolling through now. There's too much here for me to like really get into it. Some of it's just actively like stupid, but there's like this card called Jundam Out, which is Jund mana for a sorcery with retrace,
you get like a random
and then
Liliana or something.
Yeah, you create a copy of like a Jund card, and it could be like a random Jund card. It could be Tarmogoyf, Lightning Bolt, Blightning, and stuff like that. Like, and I mean that's a type of card I could see existing in paper because they've literally made Garth One-Eyed. Mox Poison as a 0 mana Mox that taps for any color, but you get 2 poison counters when you tap it for mana, and then like. I really actually like there's a cycle, if you want to call it that. There's a cycle of lands here that all have like abilities attached to them that you normally wouldn't see on a land. So there's Lazotep Archway, which is a black-white land that enters tap, but it has Eternalize, so you can exile it from the graveyard to make a 4/4 version of it, which is a really cool thing to attach to just like a random land.
Yeah, I really like like I said, the madness land of that.
Mm-hmm.
I also really like the Maestro's Totally Safe Hideout. So it enters the battlefield tap, makes Grixis mana, and has land casualty. So as the land enters, you may sacrifice a creature with power 2 or greater if you do create a token that's a copy of this land. So it's like a Grixis ramp spell, which is really nifty. There's like Intangible Vibes is one that I can see being a real card. It's like all creatures are tokens now, or all cards are tokens.
Yeah, okay, well that's the type that's like probably problematic for a lot of different reasons, but yeah, there's like a shackle mechanic here, which is basically equipment that you equip to your opponent's creature for the shackle cost. So it's kind of like an aura that
like
you can move
Vidalcan
around.
shackle kind of effect.
Yeah, well, it's like this one's called Avacyn's something color or something, but it's basically a pacifism on an equipment, but instead of paying equip cost to put it on your creature, you pay a shackle cost to put it on your opponent's creature. So it's kind of like a pacifism aura, but when that creature dies, you still have the shackle card in play that you can then pay the shackle cost to like re-equip it to another one of your opponent's creatures. So I thought that was kind of cool. I'm not going through the entire thing of mechanics here because they're really screwing around with a lot of different stuff. But there's some interesting stuff here that I wanted to mention, and just like I think we will actually see some of this in the future. Like the playtest cards, like they're gimmicky, but I think they also are just like testing the waters for future things. There's a card here that it's a spell that's an emblem, and it just goes into like it just becomes an emblem when it resolves, and it has a pretty mediocre effect. But like emblems are design space that they really have not messed with because it's dangerous design space. But like they're testing the waters. They're like this is stuff that like they're poking the bear.
They're gonna print that, and then they'll print Naturalized too, like Emblem Boogaloo, which is an actual card.
One.
Yeah, and it's like Naturalized, but it also destroys emblems and other game objects, like
kills the city's blessing. Yeah. So yeah, Mystery Booster 2, not really my cup of tea, honestly, and it's really only there for conventions anyway, so it's not the type of thing we'll ever play with. But I see some design. Some interesting design quirks in our future here, and I imagine some of these we'll see in the not too distant future.
I would like to take a brief moment to apologize to anime fans, furries, Commander players, tall people, the American education system, Ledger Shredder, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Judge Judy, the 15th President of the United States James Buchanan, Toys for Tots, the entirety of Spain, and Scruff McGruff for any hurtful words Teld has used against these individuals and communities lately. We're monitoring his behavior and assure you he's doing his best to change his ways. Thank you. Oh, and Starbucks baristas. Sorry to y'all too.